The Dying Rain, which is a crime story of sorts, and it is coming out in an anthology called The Tobacco Stained Sky. Now, it hasn't quite come out yet, but I was lucky enough not only to write a story for this anthology, but the anthology had been put together, as in the stories had been assembled, but no one was actually editing the stories, right? They didn't have a prose editor. So of course I jumped up and said, pick me, pick me. So now I am the prose editor of this, so it's like my editing debut sort of thing, like editing these 60,000 words of other people's stories, which I very much enjoyed because they were rather of a high standard than the stories I normally edit, being a teacher sort of thing. So it was a great experience. Yeah, so that book's coming out later on this year too, Tobacco Stained Sky. And I have a book for sale today called Alien Sky, which is an anthology from the same publisher that has another one of my stories in it as well, called The Last First. So if you want an Alien Sky, they're $15. So this is from The Dying Rain, and it just starts on the very bottom of page 3 there. But just to give you an idea roughly about what this is about, because this isn't the beginning of the story, I kind of chose like a middle part, alright? So basically what it is, right, is all of these stories are set in a post-apocalyptic Melbourne, right? It has to be post-apocalyptic Melbourne. And because I love Melbourne, that was fine, I didn't mind. Actually, Georgie and I, my wife over here, is actually videoing me. So hello Georgie.
Can't rock the camera.
We went to Luna Park in Melbourne, as you do, and just the scene of St Kilda and Luna Park, and there's this theatre, I think it's the Palace Theatre right next to Luna Park. Just took one look at that and just said, oh my god, this is so gothic, right? This needs a gothic story. So yeah, anyway, that's how this came about. But basically we have a dude called Tyler Bramble, who's a seeker. He's kind of a private detective, but this is a futuristic sort of situation. And he's going to be chasing after this guy called Roshandro, right, in a minute. So here we go. I ended the call just as Seeker Bureau's file on Gabe Roshandro finished downloading on the combox. I spied a lighter hidden in a pile of crumpled, unwashed laundry and proceeded to fill my lungs. I barely glanced at the file hovering in the corner of the room. I just got enough of an eyeful of Roshandro to spot him in a crowd, which wouldn't be hard. He had a shock of white hair and pale blue eyes, and he was slender and lithe like a dancer or a gigolo. I'd have to lay off the fisticuffs if I was going to get any sucker from this fellow. It must have been past midday, but my stomach was feeling delicate, and I couldn't face the thought of food just yet. So I stood at the window and looked down at degenerate Melbourne. The feeble sun ducked behind a wall of formidable-looking clouds, perhaps never to re-emerge, and the first drops hit the window right in cue. It was going to be icy down there on the coast. I was going to need something to fortify me, something warm and wet. I poured myself 3 fingers of mellow gold from the bottle on the sideboard and stood at the window again, watching the toxic rain lash the moribund city. Suddenly, I didn't feel so well or so good about the task before me, and the liquor barely registered on its way down. But a guy had to try his best, even if he knew he was likely to be knocked down like a troublesome tenpin in the corner of the rack. Feeling more like a castaway from a homeless shelter than a man with a job, a career even, in Seeker Bureau, I shuffled down to the lobby and the rain-swept street. I was rugged up under 4 layers of clothing, practically everything I owned, and I was packing all 3 of my guns. I must have looked more like an abominable snowman than the grasping arm of the rich man's law, not that anyone was looking. Those with half a brain or more were safely ensconced somewhere under cover, probably under layers of blankets and a heat lamp, and that left the street to the occasional half-frozen deviant and me. By the time I had managed to find a tram heading into the city centre that hadn't seized up from age, misuse or cold, I was reaching for my sour mash like a babe to a bottle of warm milk. Flinders Street station was all but abandoned, the card readers powered down, and I was lucky to find a tram that was heading to St Kilda today. As I stepped up onto it, the driver, a haggard-faced man with small red eyes and a whiskery face, looked at me as if to say, now you will know what it is to enter the halls of damnation. I was drinking on an empty stomach, and that was my first mistake. Whiskey might be made from grain, but it was wrong to think of it as a satisfactory meal replacement. The sound of the rain pattering on the window and the whoosh of the squalling wind served to soothe me, and thus my second mistake was falling asleep, my face pressed up against the frosted glass. Before I knew it, I was being roughly shaken awake by a nasty piece of work brandishing a metal bar and a mouthful of blackened teeth. My first thought was that I had no idea whether the creature before me was a him or a her. "Your wallet," the he-she hissed. It spat as it enunciated, spraying me with spittle. I peeled back my greatcoat with my left hand, just far enough to show the creature my right hand, cradling my trusty repeater, the one with the red pointer laser. "Want an extra hole in your face?" I said. I doubted it'd make much difference. This had the desired effect. The he-she stumped off down the aisle, leaving a noxious odour in its wake. The weather, if anything, looked even more threatening, and if you didn't know what time it was, you'd swear it was dusk and not early in the afternoon. It seemed that a great deluge was about to be unleashed. By this time, my innards were crying out for sustenance, so I braced myself and stepped down off the tram at Ackland Street. I've always had a sweet tooth, and I thought a cherry and pecan pie might tide me over until I'd done the business, if the business would present itself to being done. Besides, I didn't quite know where Rashengro would be skulking so early in the day, probably fast asleep in a coffin somewhere, and thus I'd need to make some discreet inquiries. A stiff breeze washed over me, stinging my face, and I pined for the sun, for my private island and my palm trees in my run. A swirl of litter and fallen leaves buffeted me along, and in the sharp cold my hands trembled deep inside my pockets. The place pulsed with a dark energy. Violence was never far from the surface, and the pasty faces of the hunched, shuffling passers-by were gloomy and grey. I felt that they might turn upon me at any moment, a pack of revenants lusting after my comparatively animated flesh. Some of them might be brazen ghouls, but surely the majority were only tired, depressed, or grimly nihilistic. The bright colours of the cakes and pastries in the patisserie window could not cheer me, and nor could the interior of that tiny shop warm me, where even the smells of freshly baked delicacies were muted by the intense cold. The shop front was empty except for a tiny, wizened woman, barely the height of a 10-year-old child, who stood behind an antique cast-iron till like a sea captain at the helm of a caravel. "Here's a brave one," she said, a faint coy smile tugging at her raisin face. "What'll you have?" "Cherry and pecan pie," I said, "and a coffee." She scowled. "Machine's busted." "Just the pie, then." She grunted, turned and reached up to what was for her a high shelf, then wrapped the pie in paper and slid it across the counter. $5.50. I paid and then lingered a moment longer, wondering whether I might open a line of inquiry here. "Something else?" the old woman sneered. "I'm looking for someone, a Mr. Rashengro. I thought you might know where he could be found." 20. "I'm sorry?" $20 knows where Rashengro could be found. She stood proudly at her till, and for a moment I thought she was going to ring up the charge like any other transaction, but she just stood there in a pose of haughty defiance. I paid again, and the old crone slammed the till shut with unexpected vigour. She looked up at me. "I'd have thought it too cold and much too early in the day to be thinking like that, but I suppose the blood of the young runs hotter." "Just wanted a word with him," I said. "It's a matter of business." "A very important matter, I'm sure." She licked her mustachioed upper lip. "You still haven't told me." "Rashengro has his fingers in many pies," she said. "Then give me back my 20 and I'll find someone who knows which pie he's fingering today." "Ha! I've been stood here since before Rashengro was happily swimming in his daddy's ball sack. I know where he is." I leaned over her. It wasn't hard. "Then where is he?" She glowered. "Down the hill a little, on the other side of the street. Go into the old bookshop." "Rashengro's there?" "No. A young girl called Melissa works there. Red hair, very pretty. She knows Rashengro and she knows where to find him, even on a day as foul as this. Tell her Martika says to take you to him and to charge you 50 for her trouble. Enjoy your cherry pie." "Thank you," I said and made to leave. It was raining again. "Word of advice," the old woman said. "Yes?" "When you see Rashengro, shoot first and keep shooting until you're absolutely sure he's dead. Others have tried. That's one tough fucker to kill, and I don't like your chances, Seeker." I looked back at her, standing there in the gloom with her till and her cakes. "Why are you trying to help me?" She tilted her head back and emitted a low, mean laugh. "I depend on repeat business." On the street, I shuffled onward through a penumbra of foul, stinging droplets that threatened to freeze into hail on their descent from the iron sky. I clutched my greatcoat around me with one hand and my silenced Mauser in the other. By the time I reached my destination, an inviting yellow light rising through the murk, I was thoroughly saturated. As I crossed that blustery threshold, slamming the shop door behind me with a hinge-busting crump, I felt like an intrepid explorer returning from a frozen wasteland. The walls were filled with books and the room with light, and I stood dripping on the threadbare carpet. I could hear the crackle of an open fire somewhere close at hand, and yet I took no step towards its hidden warmth. A young woman, a wraith-white redhead, entered my field of vision, but I could no longer think of what it was I was supposed to say to her. "My goodness," she said, "come and sit by the fire." She was slim and lovely, and yet her eyes conveyed a great emptiness. Without doubt, so did mine. I followed her through the shop and sat down on a tarnished couch before the open hearth. Book pages curled and blackened in the flames. "Shame, isn't it?" she said, sitting beside me. "You must be Melissa," I replied. The fire began to revive me. I cared little for what fueled it. "That's what it says on my badge, but you don't look like much of a reader." "I used to be." She tilted her head. "What happened?" I sighed. "Can I eat in here? I won't make a mess." I retrieved my pipe from within my many folds, biting into it. It was the first solid to have passed my lips in a day or more. "You've come from Martika's shop," Melissa said, "haven't you?" I nodded between mouthfuls. "But you aren't here for a book." "No, not a book." "Just a minute, I'll lock the door. No one in their right mind will be out today." She returned to her seat and offered no further comment as I finished my pie. The wind and rain shook the walls of the bookshop, but the fire endured, and so for the time being did I. I had soon to remove my greatcoat for fear of overheating, and Melissa could not help but notice my booze and at least one of my guns. I made no secret of these illicit items. I looked at her pale face and her pale hands, and I knew that there was something not right in the way she held herself, propped up like a wooden doll. She went off into a back room and returned with shot glasses, so I poured each of us a stiff measure of whiskey, and we sat for a while in simulation of companionable silence. I eventually broke it. "I'm looking for Gabe Roshandro." The words hung heavily between us like icicles. "Martika said you could take me to him," I added. "Yes, I can take you." Her voice was remote, without inflection. "Martika said I should give you $50. "50, she replied. "Yes." "Do you want it now?" Her eyes turned vulpine. "Make it 200 and we can have something to warm us up," she said. "What about the whiskey?" "It's not enough. 200. I got out my wallet, and Melissa went into the back room again. I sat uneasily, rotating the empty glass between my thumb and forefinger. I half expected her to return naked, carnivorous, and I wasn't sure whether I wanted that. She returned with a plastic sachet of white powder. In a place like this, I ought to have known. I put my money on the coffee table. For the first time she smiled, and I didn't like it. It was the smile of a ghoul about to feast on unwilling flesh. Melissa expertly cut the lines on my crisp $100 notes. She took the first hit. Her eyes rolled back in her head and she flopped onto the couch, her throat uttering an elongated "ah." She was out. I knew that I should eschew the drug, but I was hungry. My flesh was weak and my mind weaker. I snorted it up. "Rapture. How do you feel?" a dreamy, feminine voice inquired. "Embrazened," I replied. "Take me to him. Now."